All right, welcome to ETD 60. Our target today will be to understand terms like concentrated and dilute, and then be able to figure out the conductivity of various solutions looking at the chemicals that are presented for you. So this is your chance to write down the questions, see if you can draw and explain them, and get yourself ready for the assignment that's coming. All right, now we'll dive into it. Concentrated and dilute, most people have a pretty good idea. These are qualitative terms. What I want to do is give you some examples. If you look at this, I got solutions A and B. Which is concentrated and which is solute, or which is dilute? Most people would say that solution, well, A is got less solute in it compared to solution B, so this would be my dilute version. This would be my concentrated solution. More solute, more concentrated. Then, of course, I could take and present with these two solutions. I got solutions C and D. Which one's more concentrated? Well, the concentrated one in this case is C, which looks exactly like A. But this is because it is a relative term. It just has more solute compared to the one you're comparing it to. So it's all relative. So you have to take that in mind. This means that the definition is a concentrated means it's a relatively large amount of dissolved solute. And then, of course, a dilute is a relatively small amount of dissolved solute. But it all depends on what you're putting it relative to, what you're comparing it to, right? My concentrated might be different than yours. You might like your Kool-Aid really, really concentrated. I like mine very dilute, but my dilute might be your concentrated. Oh no, I've gone cross-eyed. A good example is to be something like orange juice. We tend to, of course, smart people can buy orange juice as concentrated because then they ship it to you. It's cheaper, and you don't have to pay for the cost of shipping all of that water along with it, the solvent. Then you take it, you add water to it, and you dilute it, making a little more dilute solution. Or if we consider hot sauces, right? Grandma's hot sauce, of course, has to be hot because all her taste buds are dead, so she needs it very concentrated with capsaicin. And then, of course, other folks like it very dilute, the mild version of that, right? I like it spicy. Dilute and saturated versus concentrated and unsaturated. Now, if we look at this, we can see we've got this stuff called aluminum hydroxide, and I got sodium chloride, and I made a solution that's 200 milliliters of each of them. Both of them will mix with water. They're both soluble. But you can see that I put in 5 grams of aluminum hydroxide, and in no time, it became, of course, full. The parking lot's full. It couldn't fit it all in there. But I dumped in a whopping 25 grams of sodium chloride, and it all went in there. And I could continue to add more because there's still room in the parking lot for it. So what we can see here is that this solution right here, the aluminum hydroxide, I didn't put in much solute. It is, of course, dilute. But the parking lot is full, so it is saturated. It's both dilute and saturated. If I look at the 25 grams of the sodium chloride in the same amount of water, it's got more solute, so it's concentrated, but there's still room in the parking lot, so it's unsaturated. So can something be both concentrated and unsaturated? Heck yeah, that's how some people like their orange juice, right? Why does this happen? Well, anytime you're trying to figure out a solution, you got to think about parking spots, and you got to think about 3 different things, right? Size, shape, and charge. So if we look at the aluminum hydroxide, it runs out of parking spaces quickly because, well, it's a lot bigger, right? It's basically the RV. It's got 1 aluminum with 3 hydroxides sticking off it. It's got to park into water. Now, one thing we can notice about that is also it has reduced solubility. It's less soluble because, of course, the hydroxides, they have a negative charge that water could like, but water already has one. So it's one of those insoluble anions that we run into before. Plus a 3+, not a great charge. So it's big and it's less soluble because of its charges. Sodium chloride, on the other hand, has 2 charges, a 1+ and a 1- that water loves, and it's small. So this would be like parking a scooter into the parking lot. You can fit in the spaces in between, but that's why the ocean has so much sodium chloride in it, and so does your blood, because it's very good at parking in solution, right? That's what makes it more soluble. Its size, shape, and charge fit nicely into water, whereas this size, shape, and charge are more like a RV, like your grandparents drive, that can't fit in there, right? Always think about size, shape, and charge. Now, the other part of this was figuring out how conductivity would relate to the substances that you have there. So we got 3 different substances, right? The first thing I would want to do is I'd want to draw them. As always, I got 3 little beakers, and a pen that's going to change the correct color now. And when I look at these beautiful beakers, I can see I'm going to put a couple things in them. This one, I'm going to put this stuff in called lithium chloride, right? And being lithium chloride, the first thing I notice, hey, that's a metal non-metal. So this thing is ionic. Being ionic, that means, of course, it's going to dissociate. It's going to become a lithium 1+ ions and chlorine 1- ions, because both of those guys like water. I'm not drawing the water. You got to use your mind to imagine it, right? At the same time, I could throw in this stuff called C6H12O6. Hopefully you notice there's absolutely no metals in there. This is a non-metal molecule, and it's famous. It's known as glucose. It's a type of sugar. And does sugar mix with water? Absolutely, because sugar is polar. Its polarity means that it goes into solution, and it breaks up the crystal, but it doesn't break up the molecule. It remains C6H12O6. Now, the positive and negative help it go into water, but they're still combined together. So overall, the whole molecule is neutral. It'll mix with the water, but it won't actually rip apart because this is a polar covalent molecule. That means that it dissolves, it doesn't dissociate, whereas this one dissociates. Huge difference, right? Now, the other one of those, of course, is this stuff called strontium chloride, which you hopefully know is SrCl2, right? If I throw that in, hey, that's a metal non-metal. This thing is ionic. It's going to go into solution, and being ionic, it has the chance to dissociate, and it will dissociate. That'll create inside of course, 3 separate ions, 2 chlorines and 1 strontium. They mix with the water, but they dissociate because, of course, they like water more than they like each other. And then ask, of course, which one of these would be the best conductor? Well, one thing we can see is they all have polarity. They all will mix with water. They'll all make solutions, but only 2 of them are ionic, and that means that they dissociate. And when they dissociate into ions, separated ions mixed in the water. And the other name for ions is electrolytes. Now, prior to this class, we would have done a test where you tested the conductivity, a whole bunch of solutions, and you would figure out that those ones that, of course, would be the best conductor would be the strontium chloride. The worst conductor would be the sugar water. And the second best conductor would be the lithium chloride. Now, how do we know this? It's because this, of course, is dissociated into positives and negatives. When you look at a battery, what you see is a separate positive and a separate negative, a cathode and an anode. That's because electricity needs a difference in charge to travel. It needs separated charges. So this one has a higher concentration of ions inside of it, separated ions. And whichever one has the most ions, it has the most ions to carry charge with. That means that it is the best conductor. So, of course, if I wanted to build a battery or something like that, I'd want to make sure that I use something that would dissociate and create lots of ions. The sugar water, of course, wouldn't conduct at all because it's overall neutrally charged. And this one would be less conductive because it has less ions. More ions, better conductor. Now, included with that, we have to recognize that there's a size of the ions. That's why when we look at things like the Bowen 777, what they used was they used lithium ion batteries because, of course, it dissociates very well and it carries charge very, very quickly, as well as lithium's a big loser. The only problem is it can cough up those electrons so fast that it can, create a lot of heat. Now, typically when you crack into a battery, you don't think, oh, it's just a bunch of salt. What you hopefully notice is that usually what pours out of a battery is battery acid. Now, in the lab that you would have done, you would have noticed that acids tend to be pretty good conductors. That's because acids are weird. They, of course, are a molecule, but they're a molecule that is very, very polar. You have a fight between, of course, a negative or one non-metal that's got a bigger electronegativity, and you've got hydrogen, this little guy who's pretty strong, but that means that the electrons get pulled more towards whoever's going to have the highest electronegativity. And basically what you end up with is unequal sharing, leaving one side positive and the other side negative, but it's so far in the range, it's almost ionic, and when you put it in the water, water rips the two apart, and these guys will actually dissociate. That's why we can use acid inside of batteries, because it's made of non-metals, a molecule, but it dissociates, and that's why it burns you. It's those hydrogen ions, but that's also why it will conduct charge. Now, crucially, if we look at this, the lab that you guys would have done in class is called the properties of solutions, and we were testing the conductivity of them, and the biggest idea you should notice is electrolytes are ions in solution that can conduct charge. They are dissociated ions in solution that allow you to conduct charge. That's why they carry electricity. To give you an idea of what that looks like, we can look at this image. There's a simple wet cell battery. It's got ions that have been dissociated by the water in it, and now that I have positives and negatives, those ions can move in the solution and with them carry a charge differential so that electrons can run through the outside circuit of it and do work for you. If you have dissociated ions, you can have conductivity in a solution. So if I want to use this in, say, making a battery or, say, making your brain, that's why there's a lightning bolt on Gatorade, because Gatorade, of course, contains electrolytes, ions in solution, that you then take into your body to balance out your number of electrolytes in the solution so that you can fire things like your brain and nerves, because they rely on ions moving across the membrane of your nerve cells to conduct an electrical current, an action potential, they call it. So if we're looking at Mr. Bill, of course, makes a bad habit. He likes to dry his hair at the same time he's taking a bath. Could he die if he accidentally dropped the hair dryer into the bath? It's an electric hair dryer. And the answer is, well, it depends on what he's bathing with. If he's bathing with sugar water, no problem. He's perfectly safe because it won't conduct charge at all. In fact, if he's diving or taking a bath in just pure water, he'll be perfectly safe because, well, water is one of the worst conductors out there. It's polar, but it doesn't have ions in it. But if it's tap water or salt water, that's going to contain ions that are dissociated, which means they can carry charge. So if a lightning storm ever shows up and you're in this pool and your mom starts yelling, "Get out of the pool, Jimmy!" You should get out of the pool because, of course, that burning feeling in your eyes, those are ions in solution, and it's a good conductor. A lake will do that too. And, of course, tap water will do that too. So you might not want to dry your hair at the same time you're taking a bath like Mr. Bill. Oh, no, Mr. Bill. Now, key things we should notice, of course, this means there's a huge difference between dissociating and dissolving, which is why we've harped on it all year. Salts and ionic compounds have the chance to dissociate, which means they can create really nice electrolytes. Then we run into things like molecules. And if we look at ethanol in your lab was a really bad conductor because, well, it dissolves in water, being a polar molecule, but it, of course, does not dissociate. So it doesn't create ions in solution, which is why it's not found in batteries, right? Always ask yourself, hey, what kind of compound is this? Is this going to be a polar thing? Is this an ionic thing? Will it dissociate? Will it dissolve? It explains a lot of what goes on with the conductivity. More ions, better conductor, right? The next thing we would have done in the class is we would have taken a look at solubility curves. And solubility curves bring in another thing. What does the word soluble mean? Well, a lot of people have already figured out that soluble means, it likes water. Well, that depends on a lot of things. And one thing it greatly depends on is temperature. So you would have done a lab where you're exploring how you can look at how much of a solute would actually go into a solution if you change the temperature. And to do that in that lab, of course, these graphs tell you that information, but you would have built your own graph. And what you would have done is take a bunch of solute, you would have stuck it in tubes, you would have gotten it to dissociate, dissolve, so to speak, and then you would have chilled it down until crystals reform, which meant that it was saturated. You bring it to its saturation point. From that, you would produce a curve for potassium nitrate that then would have allowed you to figure out how solubility curves work. Instead, you'll be working that with me online. Now, hopefully you've figured out what concentrated and dilute means. It's a relative measure of their amount of solute. And that means you have to always worry about what you're comparing it to. If we're looking at conductivity and I want to make a really good conductor, the key is whatever dissociates to create the most ions in solution, that will be the best electrolyte, the best conductor of electricity. Then, of course, you would have taken a look at this in your lab, and we'll talk about that next time.